Hey English 3, in this video we're going to be talking about postmodernism, Toni Morrison, who is the author of our next novel, and structure in her novel, The Bluest Eye. Now we're doing this just for the sake of time, so I'm going to move you through our American Lit timeline that we've been working with since the beginning of the year. Now we kind of skipped over something and I want to kind of clarify what that is. So we're skipping a little bit over the Harlem Renaissance and the Jazz Age. Now our last book, Gatsby, did touch on the Roaring Twenties, but we also have the Harlem Renaissance coming about. And that's really the Black cultural movement in Harlem, New York. There's lots of poetry that came out, some of which we're going to look at as we look at Bluest Eye. And it really focused on diction from the street talk of the different ghettos in the city as well. So we're going to see some of that in postmodernism as well, especially because the book that we're going to be reading, The Bluest Eye, takes place in 1940s. That being said, the book came out in 1970, so technically this book is considered contemporary postmodernism. Now, the obvious question is, what is postmodernism? So the issue with postmodernism is that it's sort of hard to define. Essentially, it's used to describe certain characteristics of post-World War II literature, but that doesn't really tell us too much. So it's kind of like 1950s to the present, and it's even kind of a question as to whether it still exists in the present, but there's lots of different ideas that we'll talk about regarding that. So, with postmodernism, instead of the modernist quest for meaning in this chaotic world, postmodern authors avoids, or they kind of play around with satire, this possibility of meaning. So, essentially, what it's saying is that you can try and make sense of this crazy world, but it's not going to work because the world is just going to get crazier. And so there's other themes that emerge because of that. That being said, if we think of postmodernism, it has similarities to modernism as well because it's different than 19th century realism. Here, instead of looking at kind of the external reality, we're looking at our inner states of consciousness. We're looking at how things are working inside of us and how we're reacting to things. So it's really about this internal struggle. And that's kind of where stream of consciousness comes from too, if you've ever heard of that. Going a little bit further, again, that chaos of the world is insurmountable, and so we have to figure out a way to play and exist within that chaos. So as I said before, The Bluest Eye is an example of postmodernist fiction. So here are some things to pay attention to as you're reading and things to take notes on. There's going to be a lot of playfulness with language. You're going to notice more of that poetic language that we saw in Gatsby. It's going to be a little more apparent in this text, and we want to think about why she's doing this. And she's really experimenting in terms of the form of the novel. We're going to talk about that soon with the structural aspects as well. So there's less reliance on the traditional narrative form where it's just chapter after chapter after chapter. And there's less reliance on traditional character development. So here you're going to see that the time is going to shift a little bit. You may get some foreshadowing at different parts, especially in the prologues. And you're also going to find that some of the information is told by different characters. So you're going to have point of view shifts. So as it says here, there's experimentation with point of view there. There's also experimentation with the way that time is conveyed. Sometimes the time is not moving chronologically. You may have flashbacks in here, and we're definitely going to see some of that. And we have to think, why is the flashback placed in the moment that it is? There's also this mixture of high art in that it's really written beautifully, and you have that figurative language, as well as popular culture. We're going to see a lot of things we recognize, some familiar names, some famous people that she notes. Technically, we are still, in terms of our American literature timeline, a part of postmodernist fiction and that movement. And the reason is because it's not really an organized movement with leaders or central figures. So in the past, we've kind of looked at these different authors. And there's plenty of authors that we could list that are postmodern authors, but it would kind of be everyone that we know. So it's really difficult to say if it's ended or if it will end at all, because we're sort of stuck in this sort of open-ended movement right now. So that brings us to our postmodern author that we'll be studying, Toni Morrison. And I want to give you some biographical information on her because a lot of the information from her past is going to be seen within this text, and we have to think what information is important. So you might want to take some notes as I'm giving you this information. So, Toni Morrison, who was born Chloe Anthony Wofford in 1931, she was born in Lorain, Ohio, which is actually the same location that our book takes place in. She's the second of 4 children, and she was born into a Black working class family, and she displayed an early interest in literature. She went to Howard and Cornell universities, and then she had an academic career at Texas Southern University, Howard University, and Yale. She's been a chair at Princeton University, and she's also been an editor for Random House. She's been a critic. She gives numerous public lectures. I actually had the opportunity to hear her speak in college, and it was pretty amazing. And she specializes in African American literature. So she made her debut as a novelist in 1970, which is when our book, The Bluest Eye, was published. And very quickly she gained the attention of critics and a wider audience for her epic power, her ear for dialogue, and her poetically charged and richly expressive depictions of Black America. She's been awarded a lot of literary distinctions, including the Pulitzer Prize in 1988 and the Nobel Prize in 1993. So a pretty notable quote by her is, and this is the quote, "The problem I face as a writer is to make my stories mean something. You can have wonderful, interesting people, a fascinating story, but it's not about anything. It has no real substance. I want my books to always be about something that is important to me and that have subjects that are important in the world, because these are the same that have always been important." So as we're reading, we have to think, well, what is she trying to say is important here? What is our takeaway? So here's some quick background on The Bluest Eye. It originally was a short story for a creative writing group that Morrison joined in 1962. She'd been turning in old school assignments, and finally the group required a fresh writing sample. She didn't have one, so she conceived and then wrote this story. Afterwards, she put it away for several years, and then she took it out again and started expanding it into a novel. When asked in an interview why she wrote Peccola, or one of our main characters' stories, she replied, "I felt an obligation to confront a certain kind of despair that exists in young girls that are growing up. And while the pain doesn't dissipate in art, it is controlled and managed." As we've discussed with a lot of the other books that we've read in the past, it's really important to keep in mind our setting and our location as well as the time. So you want to take some notes on this. As I said before, our book, The Bluest Eye, takes place in Lorain, Ohio in 1940, which is also Morrison's hometown. Pauline and Charlie Breedlove are Peccola's parents, and they moved from Kentucky to Lorain in the late 1920s, making them a part of what's called the Great Migration, where approximately 6 million African American Southerners migrated to urban centers in the North and West between the onset of World War I and 1970. Now, Lorain was a small town whose economy was based on steel and iron manufacturing. Many of the citizens worked in the town's steel mill or at the port, loading and unloading ships from the other port towns on the Great Lakes, including Detroit, Toledo, and Chicago. The town had just over 44,000 people living in it in 1940. Not so big that Claudia and Frida, two of our other main characters, could not walk from their house to the wealthy lakefront home where Mrs. Breedlove worked as a maid. While the school Claudia, Frida, and Peccola attended was integrated, the beautiful park along the lake was segregated. In 1940, Lorain's population was 76.1% white, 21.3% white immigrant, and only 2.6% African American. So now that I've given you some background about the book and the author, we're going to talk a little bit about the structure in The Bluest Eye. Now, if you flip through the book, you'll notice that each section begins with what's called a prologue. Now, the prologue is basically an introductory 1 to 2 pages, a little bit of narrative that'll give us some information that might foreshadow events or things to pay attention to. So it's really important that we read them carefully. So the first example of prologues that you'll see here are what's called primers. Now, primers were used from 1927 to the 1960s, and they're called basal readers. They're basically the books that kids were given when they were learning how to read. So here are some samples. You can see the cover. They're pretty old, but they flourished in the late 40s and the 50s when post-war affluence promised a protected world of childhood innocence. These books taught many generations how to read. They crafted dreams of gentle suburban bliss, and in the process, they became immediately recognizable as cultural icons. In fact, a lot of people pay a lot of money for these books now because they're out of publication. So if you take a look, this is a little sample of the page on the right. It says, "Sally said, 'Oh, Spot, look in here. Do you see what I see? It is something we like.'" So if you take a look at the first prologue in your book, it starts with, "Here is the house. It is green and white. It has a red door. It is very pretty." And then it goes on. Now, all of this content is taken from those basal primers. But what I want you to do before you even kind of get to reading is I want you to take a look at the images that are contained in these primers. So if you look on the left, we've got that mother with a little cat and her daughter in the background. And on the right, we have the mother who's on the phone and her children are surrounding her. So I want you to take a couple seconds, and in your notebook, I want you to write down what you notice about the mothers in these images. Anything you can, specific details are always helpful. Now I want you to take a look at the children that are focused upon in these primers. And you'll notice that some of the images look a little different. It's all based on the publication. But our main characters are Dick and Jane. And then take a look on the right. We've got a couple of other characters. What do you notice about the children in these images? And you may find that you can add on to what you noticed about the mothers in the previous one, or you may want to compare this to the children in the previous slides as well. Now take a look at these last two examples. And we've got the father and the son and the dog, and then you've got the son, the mother, and the dog. What do you notice about these images in general? Think expansively. Now that you've taken notes on primers in general, I want you to open up your book and begin that first prologue that begins autumn, and that is the one that begins, "Here is the house, it is green and white." And as you read, I want you to take notes on the following. Why would Morrison begin this section, as well as the others, with pieces from the Dick and Jane primers? What do you notice structurally about how the primers are written? And I'm really talking about what you see on the page and the way in which Morrison is writing it. And then the final question is, keeping in mind that this was a clear choice made by the author, what is the effect or purpose of writing the primers in this way, and why do you think she introduces each section of the novel with a primer? You may want to pause the video and do this now just to keep up with what we're doing. If not, you can keep on listening. There's one more step that we have to do. Okay, I know this says final step, but I actually made a mistake. There's going to be one more thing we're doing after this, but do this next. You'll notice here that I've inserted the next prologue. There's two prologues that begin before autumn. And this is the second one. It's written in italics. And I'm going to put this in our Google folder in Postmodernism under Bluest Eye. So you can copy and paste this into your own last name folder and do this. But what I want you to do is close read and annotate the second prologue, paying attention to key points and language, much like we did when we looked at the Gatsby party scene and the confrontation scene. Anything you can annotate or anything you underline, you want to jot a quick note with it. And then to close out our activity of looking at the structure of the text, notice that the book is separated into sections using subtitles, with our first section being autumn. I want you to pause and take 1 minute and list anything, any words, any phrases, any ideas that come to mind when you think of autumn. So spend a minute doing that. And then you'll notice that the rest of the book is established by seasons. It's another thoughtful choice by the author. Why do you think Morrison chose to do this? So when we meet again, I'm going to check that you have notes on the primers, that you have close read the second prologue, and that you have close read the first prologue talking about the effect of the primers, as well as the ideas about autumn. Keep in mind all of these structural elements as you read because they're going to be really important and we're going to keep going back to them. And next class we'll discuss all of these ideas. Thank you.